The year is 1944. In the steaming jungles of the Philippines, the air trembles beneath the percussion of American artillery. The sound rolls through the valleys like distant thunder, each concussion marking another fragment of the Japanese empire collapsing into ruin. The rain falls in thin veils, hissing on the molten wreckage of machines that once defined power. From a curtain of vines, a small silhouette emerges, a tank barely more than a shadow of steel. It rattles forward, its rivets vibrating with age, its paint scoured pale by years of tropical corrosion. This is the Type 95 Heigo, Japan's light tank of the 1930s, a relic born in an era of ambition, now stranded in a war that has long since outgrown it. Across the clearing, American Shermans grind their way through mud and bamboo, their 75mm guns glinting under the gray light. The Heigo turns its narrow turret. Its 37mm cannon spits once, a clean, sharp crack against the jungle air. The shell skips harmlessly off a Sherman's glacis plate, as if the laws of war had moved on without it. The answer is immediate and merciless. A burst of fire blossoms through the Heigo's thin armor. The tank jolts, then falls silent. Inside, 4 men die without time to understand why their machine failed them. Their bravery is unquestioned, but bravery cannot stop physics, nor save an empire from its own illusions. Once the Heigo was a symbol of modernity, paraded beneath the rising sun as proof of Japan's industrial awakening. But by 1944, it had become a tomb, a relic fighting a war that no longer recognized it. In the smoldering wreckage, the metal cools quickly. The jungle reclaims what the empire abandoned. Yet beyond those trees, in laboratories and shipyards, Japan is already trying to replace its ghosts. And in those secret factories, a new machine is taking shape, one meant to restore the empire's pride, but destined to reveal its final delusion. Rewind to 1937. Across the plains of Manchuria and the river valleys of northern China, the earth trembles beneath Japan's new machines. The Type 95 Heigo, light and agile, rolls forward through dust and rice paddies, its treads biting into the soft earth with the confidence of conquest. To soldiers on the ground, it feels like the future has arrived. Steel replacing flesh, motion replacing mass. In those first campaigns, the Heigo seems unstoppable. Against the scattered infantry and obsolete fortifications of the Chinese nationalist forces, its 37mm gun cuts through resistance with mechanical precision. Villages burn in its wake, roadblocks vanish beneath its treads. At last, Japan's dream of a mechanized army appears real. Commanders call it a divine chariot, the embodiment of emperor and empire moving as one. But the triumph is deceptive. The Heigo's armor, barely 20mm thick, can deflect rifle fire, but not much more. Its power lies not in strength, but in speed. And in the vast stretches of Asia, where roads are rare and the enemy disorganized, that speed feels like invincibility. Each victory feeds a dangerous illusion. Reports from the front describe near-effortless advances. Engineers back in Tokyo interpret them as proof of perfection. Doctrine begins to ossify. The tank's lightness, once a design compromise, becomes a creed. The army convinces itself that mobility will always outweigh firepower, that spiritual courage will cover mechanical weakness. In the glow of success, few question the balance sheet of war. No one asks what might happen if this divine chariot meets an equal, or something stronger. The empire's planners mistake dominance for destiny, and in doing so, they seal the Heigo's fate. For now, the tank's roar echoes triumph across the continent. But history does not pause for celebration, because even as Japan perfects its illusion of mastery, other nations are already building the machines that will expose it. The Type 95 Heigo is a study in contradiction, elegant in form, fragile in truth. At just 7.4 tons, it weighs barely half as much as the tanks rolling out of Europe. Its frame is thin, its armor scarcely thicker than a rifle plate, and yet its designers see beauty in restraint. To them, the future of war will not be decided by weight or caliber, but by speed, by how quickly one can strike, vanish, and strike again. Inside Japan's Army Technical Bureau, engineers boast of the Hago's agility. It can cross rivers on improvised bridges, climb slopes where foreign tanks would stall, and run for days on minimal fuel. Its 120 horsepower diesel engine hums like a promise that precision and discipline can outthink mass. Why build heavy tanks, one officer asks, when the enemy always runs? In China and Manchuria, that logic appears flawless. The Hago glides across open plains, its light gun cutting down sandbag defenses and unarmored trucks. Infantry flee at the sight of its silhouette, believing it invincible. Reports flow back to Tokyo filled with praise, and each word of triumph reinforces the illusion. The tank is declared perfectly suited to the needs of the empire, a phrase that will haunt it later. But perfection is a mirror that hides its cracks. Beneath every victory lies a truth unspoken. The Hago has never faced a real tank battle. Its thin armor has never stood against a cannon shell. Its light gun never tested against steel. Japan's leaders confuse the absence of defeat with the presence of strength, a mistake repeated throughout history by those who win too easily. By 1939, whispers of doubt begin to surface. Reports from the Nomonhan incident along the Mongolian border tell of Soviet armor shrugging off the Hago's fire, of Japanese crews burned alive in their thin-skinned machines. The empire dismisses these as anomalies, as if reality itself can be willed away. For now, the myth of mobility endures. Japan still believes its tank embodies divine balance, speed as strategy, lightness as virtue. But far beyond Asia, factories are already forging a new generation of steel, machines that will expose how fragile perfection can be. War, in Japan's imagination, was never meant to be a contest of machines. It was a test of spirit. Across the narrow islands of the archipelago, geography had shaped not only terrain but thought, mountains that divided, valleys that isolated, and rice fields that demanded endurance and order. From these landscapes emerged a doctrine where discipline outweighed design, and courage was counted as a weapon in itself. In Tokyo's military academies, strategy was taught not as a science, but as an art form. Tanks were not independent hunters as they were in Europe. They were servants to the infantry, moving only to assist, never to lead. To Japan's planners, the tank was a hammer for the soldier's hand, not a sword of its own. Each vehicle was a tool for supporting the advance, clearing bunkers, and breaking light defenses, not for sweeping maneuvers or armored duels. The Type 95 Heigo became the perfect expression of this belief. It was simple, light, and inexpensive, a weapon not designed to dominate, but to accompany. Its armor could stop bullets, not shells. Its cannon could scatter men, not tanks. In its every feature, it reflected a quiet assumption that war was to be won by willpower, not by weight. Where Germany built the Panzer as a machine of revolution, Japan built the Hago as a symbol of obedience, an instrument of a warrior code that prized sacrifice over survival. The tank's frailty was seen not as a flaw, but as proof of purity. Engineers and officers alike insisted that courage could bridge the gap between steel and fate. If the tank was thin, the spirit within would make it strong. This faith was sincere, but it was blind. The same cultural poetry that inspired the samurai's code now guided the empire's armies into the age of mechanization, an age that cared nothing for poetry. The West approached war through mathematics, armor thickness, muzzle velocity, range, and logistics. Japan answered with faith, ceremony, and the conviction that devotion could resist physics. For a time, that faith seemed unshakable. Victories in China, the Pacific Islands, and the jungles of Southeast Asia appeared to validate it, yet the ground beneath the doctrine was already shifting. New machines were coming, heavier, faster, and mercilessly logical, and soon the empire that measured strength by spirit would be forced to confront a weapon that measured it by numbers alone. In the years following its debut, the Type 95 Heigo was celebrated as proof that Japan had mastered the language of mechanized war. Propaganda films showed it cresting ridgelines in Manchuria, dust clouds curling around its treads like banners of victory. Soldiers saluted it as it passed, believing it to be untouchable. But behind the curtain of triumph, the truth was already beginning to splinter. The Hago's armor, only 12 millimeters thick, could deflect rifle fire, but little else. Against the 50-caliber rounds of American machine guns, or the heavier weapons of the Soviet frontier, its plates tore open like paper. When struck by a shell, the rivets that held its frame together became deadly shrapnel, ricocheting inside the crew compartment with surgical precision. Men who survived such impacts described their tanks as coffins with engines. Still, the myth endured. Japan's censored wartime press printed only images of tanks advancing, never burning. Official communiques spoke of courage, speed, and victory, omitting the quiet attrition suffered in jungles and river crossings. The empire's newspapers called the Type 95 the blade of the emperor's will, but to the men who drove it, the machine often felt more like a wager, one staked against physics itself. In field reports from Burma and New Guinea, officers began to voice concern. They noted how the thin armor failed to withstand even anti-tank rifles, how fuel lines ignited under tracer fire, how spare parts were nearly impossible to obtain once the front extended across the Pacific. Some commanders pleaded for a redesign, thicker armor, stronger guns, more crew protection, but those reports rarely reached Tokyo. When they did, they were filed away, stamped with bureaucratic indifference. At home, the Army's high command dismissed the complaints as weakness. They believed morale could substitute for metallurgy, that the spirit of the samurai could bridge the gap between old steel and new war. The Type 95, rather than being questioned, became sanctified, a symbol of faith in national will. Each flaw it revealed was turned into proof of virtue, endurance over comfort, sacrifice over survival. In the end, the tank that had once promised victory became a mirror reflecting the empire's own delusion. It was not merely a weapon, it was a lie made of steel, built to sustain belief long after belief had ceased to match reality. And while Japan clung to its myth, far across the Pacific, another army was perfecting machines that would tear that myth apart bolt by bolt. December 1941. The Pacific ignites. Across half the world, the empire that had once hidden behind its islands now strikes outward in every direction. At Pearl Harbor, American ships burn beneath a rising sun. In Malaya, in the Philippines, and deep through the jungles of Burma, the Japanese army moves with terrifying precision. Among its spearheads, rattling through mud and monsoon, is the Type 95 Heigo, the same light tank once built for China's plains, now reborn as the vanguard of an empire in motion. Against the defenders of Southeast Asia, the Hago seems unstoppable. British and Dutch units, unprepared for armored warfare in the tropics, fall back in confusion as the small tanks appear through palms and bamboo, moving faster than expected, striking from directions thought impassable. Soldiers begin to call it the mosquito tank, small, elusive, but capable of stinging with deadly precision. Its speed, not its strength, defines it. On narrow jungle roads, its tracks churn up red earth as it races ahead of its own infantry, cutting supply lines and shattering morale. At Jitra, Slim River, and across Luzon, its silhouette becomes a symbol of shock. Allied troops accustomed to seeing armor only on open European battlefields now face tanks emerging from swamps and forests. For a time, the illusion of invincibility returns. Once again, the Hago fulfills its original design, fast, fearless, and suited to Asia's terrain. Tokyo celebrates the victories with the same confidence that fueled earlier illusions. To them, the tank's success is confirmation that the Empire's doctrine, lightness, mobility, and faith, was right all along. But beneath that triumph, history is shifting. Every victory brings the Empire deeper into an ocean of industrial power it cannot match. The same geography that once protected Japan now isolates it. Its tanks, ships, and planes stretch farther from home, while the United States, awakened from peace, begins to mobilize, not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. In the jungles, the Hago remains potent. On open fields, its weakness grows. When it meets the first M3 Stuarts in the Philippines, and later the Shermans on Pacific Islands, the difference is unmistakable. One belongs to an empire that believes in spirit, the other to a nation that believes in mass and mathematics. For the Hago, the age of effortless victory is ending. The mosquito has tasted blood, but ahead lies the storm of steel, and soon the Empire's lightest tank will face the heaviest truth of all. 1942, Guadalcanal. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's light tanks move not through villages or open plains, but through the suffocating green of a living battlefield. Rain hammers down in torrents, soaking the volcanic soil until it swallows the treads whole. Steam rises from the jungle floor, and amid that heat, the Type 95 Hago advances toward its destiny. At first glance, the battle seems familiar. The Japanese infantry move with practiced precision. The tanks follow, engines whining through the mist. But ahead, unseen among the palms, waits a new kind of enemy. The U.S. Marines, hardened by training and supplied by a nation of factories, dig in with a confidence Japan's soldiers have never faced. And behind them, glinting faintly through the rain, are the shapes of M3 Stuart tanks, heavier, broader, and built for a different age of war. When the Hagos encounter them, the truth is immediate and merciless. The first shot from an American gun strikes at 500 yards. The round punches through the Hago's thin 12mm armor and exits through the opposite side, leaving a wound no repair can mend. Inside, the crew dies in an instant. The tank burns cleanly, its rivets exploding outward like sparks of betrayal. It is the moment Japan's doctrine, faith over firepower, meets the arithmetic of the modern battlefield. At Tenaru, Matanikau, and later Cape Esperance, the pattern repeats. Hagos ambush where they can, their light frames darting between coconut groves, but the jungle that once sheltered them now becomes a cage. American gunners learn quickly to aim low, to wait for the sound of the diesel engine, to let the tanks come close before firing. The Divine Chariot of 1937 becomes a funeral pyre of 1942. In Tokyo, the reports arrive quietly. Pages of numbers, casualty lists, requests for thicker armor, stronger guns, better engines. Commanders in the field plead for replacements. Engineers at Sagami Arsenal experiment with heavier plating. But each new prototype fails the same test. Every ton of steel added robs the Hago of the one advantage it once possessed: mobility. Its engine strains, suspensions buckle, transmissions fail. The design's limits have been reached. The doctrine that created it forbids evolution. The Imperial Army, still believing in spiritual supremacy, refuses to abandon the concept. To question the Hago is to question the philosophy behind it, the belief that courage outweighs caliber, that devotion can substitute for steel. Even as American and Soviet engineers produce tanks twice its weight and 10 times its power, Japan clings to a relic. By late 1942, the empire's factories, already overextended by the demands of naval production, cannot afford new designs. Aluminum and steel flow to aircraft, not armor. Japan's armored core becomes a ghost of its former self, surviving on improvisation and faith. Field crews weld on scrap metal for protection, camouflage their tanks with bamboo and mud, and pray that the next battle favors terrain over technology. But technology has already chosen its side. Each battle reveals the same story. A small tank, once a symbol of national pride, destroyed by an age it can no longer understand. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, the Hago has met its giant and lost. Yet in Tokyo, the High Command refuses to believe it. They still speak of spirit, still promise victory, still imagine a world where willpower bends reality. But far away across the ocean, America's industrial heartbeat is only growing louder, and the next generation of machines will not stop for faith. 1944. Burma. The monsoon has come early. Sheets of rain fall without mercy, turning the hills around Imphal into rivers of mud and fog. For the Japanese 14th Army, this is to be the decisive strike, the bold thrust that will cut into India, destroy the British garrisons, and ignite Asia's final rebellion against the West. At the tip of that offensive, leading the long columns of infantry through the choking valleys, are tanks that once symbolized victory, the Type 95 Hago. They advance as they always have, engines whining, treads churning, their commanders invoking courage as armor. But the Burma of 1944 is not the China of 1937. Here, the jungle does not yield, it consumes. Roads dissolve under the rain, bridges vanish in floods, and every climb becomes a test of friction, of gravity, of endurance. Inside each Hago, the heat is suffocating. Steam rises from the floor plates. Water seeps into the fuel lines. What was once an agile machine now groans like an exhausted animal. The offensive begins with confidence. In the first weeks, Japanese columns seize outposts and mountain passes. The British fall back, not in panic, but in calculation. Behind them, the Indian 15th Corps and the RAF prepare their response. When the Hagos crest the ridgelines overlooking Imphal, they face not fleeing troops, but organized fire. 6-pounder anti-tank guns open up from the tree lines. British Hurricane fighters circle above, striking supply convoys with machine gun fire and rockets. The Hago, with its 12mm armor, cannot survive in this new arena. A single shell pierces through its hull. A second detonates the fuel. The tanks burn in the monsoon, flames mixing with the rain until the smoke becomes part of the sky. Yet the crews do not flee. They fight beside their wrecks, rifles in hand, their courage as desperate as it is futile. One Japanese tanker would later write in a fading diary, "Our armor is our courage. The machine fails, but we remain." It is a haunting sentence, one that captures both the nobility and tragedy of an army fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons. By July, the offensive collapses. The once proud regiments that crossed into India now die on the retreat, their supplies gone. their tanks abandoned on jungle slopes. The Hagos that do not burn are left to rust, silent monuments to a doctrine that mistook faith for firepower. The jungle, once their ally, now swallows them whole. Vines creep over gun barrels. Moss grows across the rising sun insignia. Within months, the Empire's last light tanks disappear into the mud. Imphal is more than a defeat. It is a reckoning. The Empire that once moved with unstoppable momentum now finds itself trapped in the very terrain it believed it had mastered. Japan's vision of endless advance has ended where it began, in the jungle, surrounded by ghosts of its own making. And as the monsoon rains wash over the wreckage, far away, in the laboratories of the home islands, Japan's engineers are working on something new, a desperate attempt to build a tank that can stand against the coming storm. By late 1944, the Pacific War has come full circle. The same islands that had once echoed with Japan's triumphs now await its destruction. In the Philippines, American forces return, not as the scattered defenders of 1941, but as an industrial giant reborn. Behind every landing craft, every tank, every bomber, lies the full weight of a nation that has learned to wage war as an equation. On the beaches of Leyte and Luzon, the difference is immediate. The M4 Sherman, with its 75mm gun and thick welded armor, advances like a moving fortress. The Type 95 Hago, once praised for speed and maneuver, now seems almost childlike beside it. 7 tons of thin steel facing 30 of hardened resolve. When the two meet, the outcome is foregone. The Hago's shells bounce harmlessly off the Sherman's hull. The return fire tears through its armor as if it were paper. Entire platoons are destroyed in seconds. To the Americans, it becomes mechanical work, one more obstacle to clear before the next beachhead. To the Japanese crews, it becomes ritual. With no hope of victory, they fight as their doctrine demands. To the end, they drive their burning tanks forward, even when blind, even when alone. Crews remain at their guns as flames engulf them, believing that to abandon the machine is to abandon their honor. A Marine officer would later write, "They fought with an almost sacred madness." The result is not heroism, but tragedy. The Hago, designed for the wars of the 1930s, is now fighting in the age of industrial annihilation. Its armor is too thin to live. Its gun too small to kill. Each one becomes a rolling coffin, the final expression of an empire that mistook faith for foresight. American soldiers, half in awe and half in pity, begin calling it the Matchbox. The name spreads quickly, an epitaph for the light tank that burns faster than it fights. From the skies, P-38 Lightnings and Navy Avengers sweep the roads, hunting anything that moves. On the ground, Sherman columns advance unopposed, their treads crushing the wrecks of Hagos that had dared to resist. What was once a proud fleet of armor becomes a graveyard of twisted metal scattered across the jungles of Luzon. Each wreck tells the same story, courage in service of futility. For Japan's army, there are no illusions left. The promise of spiritual victory has been erased by firepower measured in tons, volts, and pounds per square inch. The Empire's engineers had trusted in simplicity. The Empire's leaders had mistaken austerity for wisdom. Now both pay the same price. In the Philippines, faith collides with industry, and the impact is fatal. By 1945, the Hago is obsolete even before it can reach the battlefield. But the soldiers who crew it still climb aboard, still salute before battle, still believe they are serving a divine cause. Their loyalty is unquestioned, their chances non-existent. As American tanks roll deeper into the archipelago, the Hago's shadow fades from the war it once helped define. The tank that once represented Japan's mastery of mobility has become a relic in motion, a symbol of bravery trapped inside error. And yet, even as its wrecks smolder across the Pacific, engineers in Tokyo are sketching something new, a final attempt to give form to an empire's dying dream. By 1944, even Japan's engineers can no longer pretend. The Type 95 Heigo, once hailed as the pinnacle of mobility and ingenuity, is now a relic, a design born in the 1930s, fighting a war waged by the science of the 1940s. In laboratories and arsenals from Sagami to Manchuria, the truth is whispered, then spoken aloud. Our tanks are obsolete. They have seen the reports from Guadalcanal, Imphal, and the Philippines. Reports written in the language of destruction. Shell impacts at 200 yards, complete losses in minutes, crews burned alive. Against the Sherman and the T-34, the Heigo is no longer a weapon, it is a coffin on tracks. And yet the orders from Tokyo are unyielding. Fight to the last tank, defend to the last man. Inside the Army Technical Bureau, the mood turns from pride to desperation. Engineers sketch new shapes on brittle drafting paper, heavier turrets, sloped armor, thicker plating. They name them with hope. Type 3, Chi-Nu. Type 4, Chi-To. Type 5, Chi-Rai. On paper, these machines promise redemption. Tanks with guns powerful enough to face the Sherman head-on, armor thick enough to survive the first shot. But Japan has run out of everything that makes invention real. Steel is rationed. Copper is gone. Oil arrives in droplets, not barrels. The air raids have already begun. B-29s blotting out the sky above Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe, flattening the very factories meant to build salvation. In workshops choked with dust and hunger, engineers build with what remains. They scavenge steel from shipyards, melt down railway tracks, and weld scrap onto aging Heigo hulls in a tragic imitation of progress. What emerges is a parody of innovation. Armor too heavy for its engines, guns that cannot elevate, prototypes that never leave their sheds. Each attempt feels like defiance against gravity itself. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, with its 75mm gun, is the closest to a true countermeasure. Fewer than 200 are completed. None ever reach the battlefield. The Chi-To and Chi-Ri, larger and more advanced, remain unfinished skeletons as the tide of war swallows Japan's industrial lifelines. The empire that once dreamed of mechanized supremacy is now building ghosts. In their notebooks, some engineers record quiet despair. They speak of shortages, of broken machinery, of the futility of design without supply. Others, in private letters, write of shame. Shame at sending young men into battle with tanks that cannot save them. Yet publicly, the propaganda continues. The newspapers speak of new weapons and invincible steel, even as the workshops echo only with silence and the rattle of worn-out lathes. By late 1944, Japan's armored core has become a collection of fragments. Heigos, their rivets rusting and tracks worn thin, are scattered across the Pacific like relics of a forgotten era. Crews train on wooden mock-ups. Some tanks are buried as pillboxes, their engines removed, their guns pointing to the sea, waiting for an invasion that everyone knows will come. The engineers keep working, though they understand the futility. Each blueprint becomes a prayer, each machine a confession. They know they are drawing the anatomy of extinction. In a nation built on precision and pride, the tanks have become metaphors for the empire itself, beautifully crafted, tragically fragile, and unable to evolve fast enough to survive. And even as the final designs take shape on paper, high above them, American bombers are already tracing fire across the night sky, erasing the factories, and with them, Japan's last dream of steel. Early 1945. The island of Luzon, once Japan's symbol of conquest, is now its final battlefield. Around the ruined outskirts of Manila, in the jungles and ridgelines to the north, the remnants of Japan's armored divisions take their positions. There are no reinforcements coming, no supply lines left, and no illusions of victory. What remains are fragments, a few dozen Type 95 Hagos, patched with scrap, manned by crews who know they are going to die. They wait in silence, engines cold, guns loaded. In the shadows of palm trees and shattered villages, they prepare their ambushes with the precision of ritual. Each tank is carefully concealed beneath branches and mud. A final act of faith in tactics that once worked in Burma and Malaya. But this is 1945, and the enemy that comes for them is not the same. The first American Sherman tanks appear at dawn, massive, steady, unhurried. They roll forward like inevitability itself, their turrets scanning, their treads chewing through fields once plowed for rice. Behind them, flamethrower carriers and half-tracks form a moving wall of steel. When the Hagos open fire, their 37mm shells bounce harmlessly off the Sherman's hulls, leaving only bright sparks and echoes. The reply is instantaneous. One round from the Sherman's 75mm gun pierces the Hago's paper-thin armor. The tank bursts apart in a plume of fire and shrapnel, its rivets exploding inward like bullets. What follows is not a battle, but an execution. American infantry, supported by artillery and airstrikes, turn the surrounding jungle into a furnace. Flamethrowers sweep through the undergrowth, igniting tree lines and foxholes. When the flame touches the tanks, they ignite from within, diesel and ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. From a distance, it looks almost like fireworks. Up close, it is horror-rendered mechanical. Yet the Japanese crews refuse to surrender. Many fight until their guns jam or their engines fail, and then continue the battle on foot. Some, wounded and cornered, pull the pins of grenades inside their burning tanks, choosing to die within the steel that once symbolized their nation's strength. American soldiers find the wrecks afterward, hatches welded shut by heat, silhouettes frozen at the guns, bodies unrecognizable. One U.S. observer wrote later, "They fought until they ceased to exist. For the Japanese tankers, death is no longer a tragedy, but an obligation. Their loyalty to the empire, to each other, outlives the machines they command. Each explosion becomes a small requiem, an ending both heroic and futile." By the end of February, the Japanese 2nd Tank Division no longer exists. Its survivors are scattered through the hills, their tanks smoldering in rows along Luzon's roads. The once proud armored corps that had thundered through China and Southeast Asia now lies broken beneath American treads. The Hago, Japan's first great machine of war, ends not with evolution, but extinction. When the smoke finally clears, the fields around Manila are littered with burned wrecks, metal husks blackened by flame and rain. The jungle, indifferent to history, begins to reclaim them. Vines twist through shattered turrets, insects hum where crews once spoke. The empire's dream of mechanized glory dissolves into rust. And yet, even in defeat, there is a strange dignity. The Hago's final battles are not measured by victory, but by conviction, the refusal to abandon faith, even when faith has turned against them. The tank that once embodied Japan's pride has become its eulogy. But the war is not yet finished. Far to the north, on the home islands, the empire prepares for the unthinkable, a last defense that will summon every machine, every man, and every illusion still standing. By 1945, Japan's armored corps no longer exists in any recognizable form. What remains are scattered hulks, half buried in mud or left rusting under jungle canopies across the Pacific. In the home islands, where invasion now feels inevitable, the army gathers the survivors, the last Type 95 Hagos, battered and obsolete. There are too few to mount an army, too damaged to be repaired, but they are not scrapped. In a nation now sustained by desperation, even ruin has purpose. The once proud tanks that had raced through Malaya and China are hauled to the coastlines of Okinawa, Kyushu, and Honshu. There they are dug into hillsides and buried up to their turrets, transformed into stationary bunkers. Their engines are removed, their tracks discarded. Around them, concrete and sandbags form crude fortifications, turning what was built for motion into immovable metal tombs. From a distance, they look like half-forgotten fossils, relics of a vanished age waiting to face the inevitable. In the workshops of Tokyo and Yokohama, engineers receive new directives: convert every remaining vehicle into a weapon of sacrifice. The Hago's mobility, once its greatest virtue, is now irrelevant. What matters is explosive power, how much damage it can inflict in a single moment of annihilation. Mechanics strip the interiors, fill the hulls with explosives, and rig crude detonators. The plan is simple and terrible. Drive these tanks directly into enemy formations or landing craft, detonate on impact, and die with honor. Some Hagos are mounted with fixed charges of up to 200 kilograms of TNT. Others are packed with gasoline and ammunition to guarantee ignition. The crews, often young men with minimal training, are told that their sacrifice will save Japan from invasion. They believe it. They paint prayers on the hulls, fold family flags beneath their seats, and wait for orders that will send them one way. The empire that once preached the supremacy of the machine now turns its machines into coffins. Among the engineers, silence replaces pride. Men who once celebrated innovation now watch as their creations are turned into instruments of suicide. One designer, who had worked on the Hago since 1935, writes in his notebook, "It no longer fights the enemy, it fights our shame." The machine that once embodied progress has become the physical expression of regret, steel shaped by denial, now repurposed by despair. By the spring of 1945, American forces reach Okinawa. When their tanks and landing craft close in, they encounter these buried Hagos, motionless, hidden beneath soil and camouflage. They fire once, sometimes twice, before being obliterated by artillery or napalm. Others are driven from concealment in final charges, engines sputtering, detonating themselves against Shermans or supply trucks. None survive. The Hago's final service to its empire is not victory, but symbolism, a demonstration that Japan will destroy itself rather than surrender. It is the last act of a doctrine that began with faith in simplicity and ends in the worship of sacrifice. When the war finally ends in August, a few dozen Hagos remain scattered across Japan's defenses, silent, charred, half-buried. The engineers who outlived them walk among the wrecks, unable to look for long. They see not tanks, but gravestones, monuments to a generation's misbelief that courage could triumph over calculation. The tank that once defined Japan's rise now defines its fall. It has lived every stage of its empire's story: birth in ambition, glory in conquest, failure in arrogance, and death in shame. The Hago has literally become its own worst enemy, a weapon that destroyed itself as surely as the nation that built it. And when the guns finally fall silent, the last echoes of its treads fade beneath the sound of rebuilding, as Japan turns from the worship of war to the quiet machinery of peace. August 1945. The guns fall silent, and across the Pacific, the smoke clears to reveal the wreckage of an empire. On beaches, in jungles, and in mountain passes from Burma to Saipan, the remains of more than 2,000 Type 95 Hago tanks lie broken and forgotten. Their turrets rust in the rain, their tracks have fused into the soil. Once symbols of progress and pride, they now stand as monuments to a vanished certainty. Japan's belief that faith could replace steel, that courage could outrun the machine age. In the months following surrender, Allied soldiers wander among the wrecks. For some, the sight is anticlimactic. The tanks are smaller than expected, almost delicate, like toys left out in a storm. American engineers examine them, note their weaknesses, and move on. For the victors, the Hago is a curiosity, an artifact of another mindset. But for Japan, each rusted hull carries a different weight, the physical remains of a national illusion. Scrap collectors soon arrive. They work methodically, cutting apart the wrecks with acetylene torches, loading the pieces into trucks and ships. The steel is melted down, recycled into tools, machinery, even kitchenware. The metal reborn for a piece it was never meant to serve. Piece by piece, the empire's armored heart dissolves into utility. The transformation is practical, yet symbolic. What was once a weapon of domination becomes a material of rebuilding. No one holds ceremonies for the fallen tanks. There are no monuments for the crews who died inside them, no flowers laid upon the burned hulls. Japan's streets are filled with the living. Survivors searching for food, families rebuilding homes from ash. The war machines are left to fade quietly, their legacy too painful to name. Yet every rivet tells a story. Every crack in the armor, every hole punched through by a shell, is a silent record of the collision between belief and reality, the moment when an empire met the truth of the modern world. Historians would later describe the Hago as a transitional design, a footnote in the evolution of armored warfare. But to the men who built and fought in it, it was never transitional. It was everything. It carried their hopes across continents, bore their names and prayers, and consumed their lives in fire. More than a machine, it was a mirror reflecting Japan's national identity, elegant, disciplined, determined, and ultimately unprepared for the ruthless mathematics of industrial war. As the years pass, the Hago fades from memory. Jungle roots split open its hulls. Coral grows through its gun barrels on Pacific reefs. Children climb on the remains, unaware that beneath the rust once beat the heart of an empire. What survives are fragments, museum pieces, photographs, stories whispered by veterans who no longer speak with pride but with quiet disbelief. In those ruins, there is a strange peace. The tank that once embodied aggression now rests in stillness, reclaimed by the world it once tried to conquer. Its steel, once hot with ambition, has cooled into memory. Japan's war is over, but its machines remain, silent teachers of a lesson written in iron, that faith without foresight is fragility, and courage without reason is tragedy. And yet, even as the Hago disappears into history, a new Japan is beginning to rise, one that will forge a different kind of strength, not from conquest, but from creation. In the quiet years after the war, Japan begins the slow task of rewriting its own story. Entire chapters of the conflict vanish into silence, and among them, the Type 95 Hago almost disappears. In the new national narrative, there is little room for the tank that once symbolized ambition and now embodies defeat. The machines are gone, the factories rebuilt, and the people turn their gaze from war toward recovery. What was once a triumph of engineering becomes a footnote in the margins of history. Yet time has a way of uncovering what nations prefer to forget. In the decades that follow, historians and collectors begin to rediscover the Hago, not as a relic of failure, but as a window into the soul of its age. They find its remains buried beneath vines in the Philippines, half submerged in rice fields across Manchuria, standing as memorials in the Pacific Islands. Each discovery prompts the same realization. The tank was not simply a weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting Japan's wartime paradox: brilliance without adaptability, mastery without perspective. In its design, the Heigo was a triumph of efficiency. It could traverse terrain that European tanks could not, operate in tropical climates, and perform with mechanical elegance. It embodied the precision of a nation that had mastered metallurgy, miniaturization, and discipline. But its weakness lay not in the steel itself. It lay in the assumptions that shaped it. Japan had built a perfect machine for yesterday's war, and by the time tomorrow arrived, it was already obsolete. The Hago's story thus became Japan's story. A nation that prized innovation failed to evolve with the world it sought to dominate. Its engineers were not ignorant. They were trapped in a doctrine that valued faith over data, pride over pragmatism. The same cultural virtues that had produced loyalty and precision also created rigidity. The tank's downfall was not mechanical, it was philosophical. Today, a few Hagos survive in museums. In Kubinka, in Bovington, in Tokyo's Yushukan. Visitors often pass them by, mistaking their size for insignificance. Next to the towering Shermans, T-34s, and Panthers, the Hago looks almost fragile, a child among giants. But its smallness tells a deeper truth. It represents a time when a nation mistook simplicity for purity and faith for strength. The paint has faded, the metal has dulled. Yet in its silence, the Hago still speaks. It asks a question that outlived the war, one that echoes far beyond the battlefields where it once burned. How could something so capable become so blind? The answer is not found in its armor or its gun, but in the minds that built it. Men who believed that the courage of the pilot, the soldier, or the tanker could outlast the logic of modern war. For Japan, that illusion cost an empire. For the world, it remains a warning. Technology without humility is a kind of blindness, and belief, when chained to pride, becomes its own destruction. The Hago sits in its glass case, a ghost of steel and doctrine. Children peer into its turret, unaware that within its quiet frame lies the story of an entire century's transformation, from conquest to consequence, from machinery to memory. And somewhere in that stillness, beneath the weight of dust and time, the little tank that once carried an empire still whispers a truth history will never forget. The Type 95. Heigo was never just a tank. It was an idea made of steel, the physical expression of a nation's confidence, its discipline, and its blindness. When it first rolled from the factory floor in 1935, Japan believed it had forged a symbol of modernity, a machine that would carry the empire's destiny across Asia. For a time, it did. The Hago cut through Manchuria and China like a blade through mist, light, efficient, unstoppable. But every triumph concealed its flaw. It was built for the past, not for the future. What began as a weapon of progress slowly became a mirror reflecting Japan's decline. The same qualities that had once defined its brilliance, simplicity, lightness, faith in spirit over steel, became the very reasons for its destruction. The Hago was a perfect embodiment of the doctrine that made it: swift, courageous, and tragically inflexible. It could outrun its enemies but not outgrow them. In the end, the empire's ingenuity met the immovable weight of industrial reality. By the final years of the war, the Hago was no longer a tool of conquest, but a symbol of desperation. Buried in sand as bunkers, filled with explosives as suicide bombs, it became a weapon that fought not the enemy, but the fear of surrender. In that transformation lies the heart of its tragedy, a machine designed to move, forced to die standing still. Its thin armor became both literal and moral, the fragile boundary between belief and truth, courage and delusion. Even in ruin, the Hago tells a story greater than itself. It speaks of a time when nations believed machines could embody ideals, when technology was seen not as an instrument, but as identity. Japan's engineers built with extraordinary skill, but they built within the walls of conviction. They mastered metallurgy and precision, but not humility. The result was not just a failed tank, but a prophecy that progress without balance, pride without foresight, turns creation into destruction. Today, its remains still lie scattered across the Pacific, in jungles, on beaches, beneath coral and moss. Children play near them, tourists photograph them, historians measure their rivets and plates, but to stand before one in silence is to sense something deeper, the weight of dreams that mistook motion for mastery. The Hago's rusted hulls are no longer weapons. They are teachers, reminders that every machine carries the philosophy of its makers, and that philosophy, if unexamined, can destroy what it seeks to defend. The Hago's story is not simply about Japan's defeat. It is about the universal tension between ambition and wisdom, between belief and understanding. Its legacy endures not in the battles it fought, but in the questions it leaves behind. In the end, the Type 95 Hago was everything Japan wanted to be: swift, brave, and unyielding, and everything it could not afford to remain. Its engine has long since gone silent, yet its meaning endures. They built it to conquer Asia. In the end, it conquered them.